Welcome to the third season of Heard, Afros and Audio interview series. My guest today is Monica Sanders. How are you today?
I am doing great. It's so good to see you and to be here with you. Thanks for having me.
Of course, I'm very excited to learn a little bit more about you. This is the opportunity for me to connect with folks in a way that I don't always get to, just running around doing what I got to do. So I'm looking forward to connecting with you. And once we're connected, you can't get rid of me. Okay.
Yeah, we never know what the world has in store for us, right?
Absolutely. So let's just jump in, talk about the Undivide Project.
Yeah.
I got a question for you. I got a question for you.
Oh, you got a question for me.
Yeah,
Okay, well, I'm
yeah,
ready
yeah.
to talk about loving Black people and how this is for us, but I'll let you ask your
For sure.
question first. Given
Okay,
it's
thank
your
you so
show,
much.
right?
Thank you so much. All right. All right. What inspired you to combine climate justice and digital equity as the focus of your work in the Undivide Project?
So it started in Baltimore. I was asked to come to West Baltimore and work on an internet connectivity project. And we came to realize, for a variety of reasons, fiber backhaul was not brought into that section of Baltimore. And when we were walking around to think about, can we do community Wi Fi, where we put the infrastructure, so forth and so on, I realized it was so cold in that neighborhood. And then as we were walking around, there's this lead factory that is still there in the neighborhood. The battle to get that removed goes on. And the lead's not contained in appropriate silos. And every time it floods, you can see the black marks on the streets and on people's steps to their brownstones where the water has mixed with the stuff. And I said, the historical divestment of Black communities have put us in this position to where we have to fight for access to the internet and all the opportunities that come with it. We have to be on this battle for climate change and unpredictable temperatures in urban neighborhoods. Like some people say urban heat islands, but then you come to realize that the lack of vegetation increases exposure to cold too, which was why it was so cold that day, because there was nothing that was a buffer to any of the climate impacts that we were having. And so that was the first thing. The second thing I realized is that when we do research about climate impacts, we rely on sensors and sensor networks that have to be aligned in a mesh with Wi-Fi. So we can't
Mhm.
get good data about what's happening in these neighborhoods because there's no Wi-Fi in the neighborhood. And people there can't access any information about what's happening to them. And so what happened was that day in Baltimore, speaking of when you join with people, you never get rid of them. Me and the people in that neighborhood are still collaborating on some stuff. Now, almost 5 years later, I said, you know what, we need to do it all at the same time, quickly, and those of us that have the resources and the knowledge to understand what to do about it need to get uniquely focused on tackling this issue in our communities. And so that's how we came up with the Undivide Project. We were saying we got to get together and cross this digital divide together and deal with these existential crises in an undivided way. So that's the story.
Yeah, and I really appreciate that. I was born in Baltimore. I didn't grow up there, but I went to Coppin State. And if you know anything about that area of Baltimore, I remember looking to my left and saying, I really hope my school isn't over here. And then looking to my right and it said Coppin State College, now university. I was like, oh, okay, here we are.
Yep.
And Mondawmin Mall is right behind it where the deli meat. We're college students. That's the first thing we're going for, the easy stuff. And it was always spoiled, not
The
right.
worst. Mm-hmm.
You quickly realize, like you said, the divestment, the disparity, the deliberateness of the systemic impediments in our neighborhoods. But it's why it's so important to have people like yourself on these teams because what you pick up on and recognize as an issue, like a real one, this is an actual real issue that needs to be resolved and fixed before we can even do anything else. Or simultaneously, that's the importance of having folks like yourself on these teams.
Yeah, because people will know academically or from reading journalism, oh, I read about redlining, so I get it, or oh, I read about urban heat issues, or I posted on Instagram back in 2020 at the height of BLM. But they don't realize that this transfers from one generation to the next and how It impacts how people see themselves and how they feel about their abilities to change things for themselves. Like, they don't understand that. And they don't understand what their individual duty is to these folks because it's othered, right? Like, these are the Black folks that are over there and they're somehow different to me. Whereas I'm like, we have deep historical blood struggle bonds that, just because I receive certain privileges does not excuse me from my responsibilities to you as another human being and also to another
Mhm.
Black person.
Right.
So yeah, it hits different.
Oh yeah, it definitely hits different. And surprised we didn't create the issue as we are being observed and witnessed as if this is our state in life. And even ourselves being in those spaces, sometimes we're like, why are we here? Why did this happen? Why is my family in this situation? Why can't we? It's so much deliberate historical reasons for this. Is not something that we chose at all. It's something that we live with and exist in and do the work as well. This is what we do as a community. There's mothers and grandmothers and fathers and grandfathers who worked to make a change that they might have not had that level of governmental influence, policies, and that sort of thing that just keep it going. So I really appreciate how you talked about what the issue was in general. Was such a great breakdown of what's happening. And again, we observe a lot. We don't know a lot in a lot of ways. And so we theorize. It's something to
Mm-hmm.
theorize and it's something to actually know what's going on. What is that black stuff? Uh, Nobody knows that. It's just after a rain. What do you think is sediment or dirt? You don't realize that there's lead and health issues.
And the reason why your child is out of school sick so much when it's cold is because their lungs were already weakened from breathing this stuff in all the time. So when flu season is hit stronger for everybody else, your kid spends half the school year in the emergency room because you live next to a lead factory or a trash incinerator. And these are to use a research term, the comorbidities. But the thing about our communities that other people will come to know and should know is that Black people continue to create and thrive despite all of these often state sanctioned tools to remove us from our communities, remove our economic power, kill us sometimes if we're being straight honest. But yet and still, you will see Black folks figuring out ways to start informal businesses and informal knowledge networks, as we always have done. And then when we do get political power, whatever Black people do that is good for everybody.
Hmm.
When we spoke out about police brutality, it wasn't stop killing Black people. Stop killing the autistic child that you don't understand. Stop rounding up undocumented kids and putting them in cages. It was never just like oh, stop hate against our particular community. And once we get our thing, we're out of it. Like, we are perfecting and making this country better, despite the fact that we don't get a return on investment. Right. Um,
Absolutely.
and so it's also when I work in communities is to part of our tagline is like reclaiming, and that is about reclaiming narratives about ourselves. To say we're going to do this because we can, and because
Absolutely.
I have an advanced degree or this dude on my team has a PhD. That's a different kind of knowledge. It's not a superior knowledge. Grandma knows way more than I ever will about what's going on in this neighborhood and has
Hmm.
created more things than I ever will. And we need to acknowledge our own greatness, even if we are in some of the quote unquote toughest places in this country. So that's another thing that I think is important to understand, that we uniquely understand about each other.
For sure. It's one of our superpowers is that resourcefulness, that ability to find joy, find innovative ways, imagination. We embody that. Yeah, that's our narrative.
Just think about it. We're only 13% of the population. At our height, we were 20% of the population. Think about outsized influence on the contours of this country of people who only make up 13% of the population.
Hmm. For sure.
So we can fix this other thing. That's what I do when we start. I was like, oh, we can fix this. People have human and civil rights in this country because of us. We can deal with that lead factory. So let's get after it. Like, if we
Yeah,
really get together, we can do this.
for sure. For sure. And part of that is awareness, first and foremost, because once we know a thing, then we can do something about a thing. Thank you so much for sharing this. This is always about amplifying the podcast, but we are people who podcast. So it's important that we talk about who we are and what we do and what we care about, because it is where the creative work comes from. It's the extension of self. So I really appreciate you sharing that. So, how has your background as a law professor and climate advocate shaped the approach and tone of your podcast?
The first step is being an advocate, is understanding that I get to be a law professor and an advocate and amplify in certain spaces because I'm in the network. And so, understanding that, I knew that I wanted to highlight people that didn't have the same access as I do. So, in our second season, I only talked to amazing women who were doing the work and uplifted them. And some of them, we did a version of the podcast. It was audio, and then we did video. And a couple of them, I wrote Forbes.com pieces for them so that I could even boost their profile even more. And then on the first season, and this is where my training as a law professor came in, is I know the legal reasons why we have all of these issues in our communities. And I wanted to bring forward business leaders that also understood those things and were creating businesses and opportunities that broke through those challenges. So, for example, one of my favorite guests was this guy in the Netherlands that he says, when I started my company, I did blind hiring. He said, no, check the box. I don't care if you had a felony, if you paid your debt to society. I don't care what your name is. I don't care what your skin color is. If you know how to do the thing, you know how to do the thing. And I ended up with this incredibly diverse group of people. My company is successful because I have all kinds of folks. And so those are the two things. It's knowing that not everyone has access to creative networks like the one that you run and that a lot of us get to participate in and create. And it's a responsibility to amplify them. But also, again, like to your point about awareness, to let people know, you know, not every company is looking to extract as much as possible. There are some great ones out there, and we need to devote our attention and resources that way and stop worrying about what people are doing on Twitter or X or whatever we're calling it, and know who these people are and put our energy over there.
For sure. The work has been happening, and it's about folks who care but also have the knowledge to push through those narratives, have the reach and the exposure. Because that's another thing that stunts us in some ways is exposure through the education, Baltimore school system. And we don't have to go into it. There's a lack of exposure in a lot of ways that when we are able to open up those spaces and allow for the expansion of young people's worldview, adults' worldview, they're ready. They got it. They're prepared. It's just give me the opportunity and let me show you what can be done. But that's the problem that we face in a lot of ways deliberately. And so when we understand that, we can move forward a little bit better than when we think it is us and we've done something somehow wrong to experience the things that we experience.
Exactly.
The Undivide Project podcast, X Changemakers Edition, focuses on inspiring stories of individuals making an impact. What criteria do you use to select your guests?
So we wanted it to be my first thing, and nothing against PR folks because they have helped me along the way. I wanted to make sure that people self nominated or were nominated from communities, right? Because per what you said, these are the folks who don't get the exposure because they don't have a big PR firm pitching them to podcasts. Um, I wanted them to be change makers who had come from some sort of marginalized background. And either because of or despite that, they were making these great initiatives. Like one of my guests is the Latino man that I don't think we give credit for creating Energy Star, but there he is. So I got to talk to Senor Salinas about, sir, you created Energy Star. Why didn't I learn about you in my science book? We know why, but this is why. So that was one of the criteria. And then also the difference had to be in climate or social justice work. And there had to be a track record of it. So, Energy Star was created 40 years ago. So talk about the work has been getting done. Like he's been doing that work. He didn't just pop up and create an Instagram community 2 years ago and now calling himself a climate advocate. So those were the criteria. And the same thing for the second season, women, same criteria, but we wanted to just focus on women. And we're prepping for our third season, and we're only going to do grassroots community activists, those grandmas that you were talking about, or the sisters that started small nonprofits that typically can't access media resources to amplify their work. So, yeah,
Mm,
that's how we choose our guests.
that's awesome. Tell me the reason for the Undivide Project. Why the name?
It was meant to be a play on words
Mm,
because the first discovery of the topic that we talked about was in a community that, when I first walked in, was suffering from the digital divide. So, first, you're like undoing the digital divide, but then also undoing these other intentional divisions of our communities from access to the benefits of this country. And also being deliberate in that the only way out is up, and the only way we can go is together.
amen.
So it's meant to play on all of those concepts.
Thank you. That was a curious question. I was like, let's find out why the name. So now we
And
know.
it's meant to get people to ask one of us, right?
Yeah,
Why that? And then we get to tell
for
you.
sure. All right. So, can you share a moment from the podcast that reinforced why these conversations are so essential for the climate and digital justice?
There are a lot of them, but one of them that stayed with me, and it says so much about who we are, is I got to talk to Ashley Nussman Berry about the Black Farmers Initiative. And if you go back and look at the video, and I'm not just promoting my podcast, Ashley is everything that we think about when we talk about Black women, and everything comes from Black women. So she's smiling at me with this beautiful smile, telling me this story about being in a Facebook group with just urban farmers generally. And when we started to go through the trials and tribulations that we went through from late 2019 to early 2023, the Black members of the community were just wanting to post or to talk about how access to farming and outdoors can be a healing experience, and really asking the question of what can we contribute to this situation. And people were banning them for groups, and the Facebook content moderators were pulling down everything that they were saying. And she's telling this awful story with a smile on her face. And they broke out and created their own group. And that group grew from being a Facebook group to now being this national initiative to reintroducing us to farming without shame, without the taint of slavery, like doing it, like rediscovering our roots. And I said, I'm looking at this beautiful soul telling this awful story of being stamped down intentionally, both by a certain community, but then Meta as a conglomerate. And she's got a smile on her face. And anyone that looks at her and hears this can think of 1,000 women like her that have smiled under duress and then created something beautiful out of it. And sometimes I go back and look at the clip and just think about Ashley. I was like, that is the remarkable beauty of us.
Yeah, for sure. I grew up on a farm from 6 months to 7 years old. So anytime farmers are in the building in conversation, it makes my heart proud, and I appreciate the service because we're still here and it's so important. Uh, our connection to the land, the fact that it was such a sustainable community for our whole community is so important to keep the conversation going. Seeing now, even younger, like millennials starting to own land and farms, it's just so exciting.
Yeah, I love
I did
it.
yeah, yeah. I did another interview for this third season with a woman named Morgan Gray, and she's in Mississippi. And in the food desert, it's desolate. She doesn't even have Wi-Fi at her house, and she works for the Farmers Association there. And I was just like, thank you for your service because she's doing the work, and she's a Gen X. She's new to this, but it's so important that we understand Ashley's story and Morgan's story and stories like mine of how important the land and the water, fishing and crabbing, I grew up doing that too, is for our sustainability.
Oh, yeah. I grew up in New Orleans. We have a lot of family by blood and by bond out in Terrebonne Parish, Louisiana. And so, yeah, the wide open spaces, the care for the land, understanding that much of that is who we were before we were forced to do it in other ways, and that it's not only okay, but it's necessary to reclaim that.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yes, it's so important and it's such a wonderful thing. And I love seeing young people doing it. And I don't know if you've been watching Khalees, like in her second act, like
Oh
she's
yeah,
over in Africa helping people. I was
yeah,
just like, this woman is farming all over the world. Good for her. And so,
yeah. It
sustainability
becomes,
again.
yeah, yeah. It becomes that possibility for us and others because we have been deliberately so distant from the land and the healing of the land. I'm also a camper and an outdoorsman, and it's nothing like it to move away from this here desk, from these here
Right?
walls, and to be
Mm-hmm.
out in nature. So I appreciate that. I'm looking forward to listening to that episode.
I was going to just say, really I second that. And that's another thing that we're doing besides our podcast. We got some support from Nat Geo to go and explore and do some more storytelling in some of these communities, like where Morgan is, and then also in the Black Belt of Alabama, and talk about people who are doing that work there. So I was just going to say it's important. And we're not stopping. Just because we did it one season doesn't mean that the storytelling ends there.
That's awesome. I definitely will connect you with Morgan because she's doing some exceptional work. She's a dynamic young woman. I really appreciate that conversation. So yeah, that's awesome, and that's what this is all about, right? Connection and knowing that we exist out here and we're doing the work. Because without that, we can't connect and work together. So it is so important that we begin to connect ourselves with these stories of folks both in the past and present.
Mhm.
Yeah. So one of your podcast core missions is to amplify underrepresented voices. How do you ensure these stories resonate with the audience?
Well, a couple of ways. One of them is, even though they are BIPOC folks and folks from divested communities, the topics are usually news of the day. So people want to talk about sustainability, they'll come and listen to our podcast, or they want to talk about the latest in tech. But now they're engaging with something they had an interest in anyway, but with someone that they did not know was a subject matter expert. And some of our policy work, or the topic about Gen Z. So a few of our guests were Gen Zers, and we were talking about sustainability, but we were also talking about, oh, Gen Z is lazy. And I said, you're a UN ambassador. That doesn't sound lazy and disconnected to me. So
Mhm.
while you may want to be keeping up with what's going on in New York at the UN, it's not all the same old people. These are these Gen Zers that I've been told are this way or that way. So that's really how we do it, is we make sure that the voices are being presented in the context of news or topics that people want to engage with anyway. We're just showing them a different SME.
Got it. Okay. And what challenges have you faced in bringing grassroots perspectives to a broader audience, and how have you overcome them?
The first challenge was in the pitching, the funding. Like with any enterprise, be it nonprofit, podcast, don't just tell me how great I am. Will you write a check? So that was one of the initial challenges when we had no episodes out, no proof of concept, was getting people to fund it. And honestly, the first season was crowdsourcing from some donors that had contributed to the Undivide Project, and we're like, oh, okay, I'll give you a couple $100s to throw at this, or I'll donate the equipment to you, and that sort of thing. But when I really overcame it was in season two, when people saw the amount of traffic that it was getting on YouTube and particularly on LinkedIn, then people were more willing to buy into it.
Hmm. Yeah, and I asked that question because it's so important for folks who have that same heart and want to create projects that are community centric, people focused, understanding the way forward in a lot of ways. And everyone is not going to be on board at the beginning. We have to convince folks that it's worth paying attention to. And the convincing is the work, not stopping because they aren't convinced yet. It'll come, but mostly you're doing the work because it's your calling. It's something that you were called to do. And a lot of times, what I've discovered, and one of the catalysts for Afros in audio, was when those opportunities don't come or that immediate support. I always think about the people who just stop in that moment and say it's not worth it. Nobody cares. It doesn't matter, and so I'll just figure out something else to do. Hell no! You do what you got to do.
Absolutely. That's my thinking. And I'm also fortunate to have the elders in our family still around.
Mhm.
My great uncle was an integrating member of the 82nd Airborne.
Wow.
Can I look this man in the eye and tell him I can't do something? Can you imagine the stuff he went through to be the first one? And also, when we took in what the 82nd Airborne does, we're like, man, you were crazy all the way around. You were like, I want to jump out of planes into hot zones. I'm going to be the first brother to do it. And you're either going to let me do it or you're going to send me to Leavenworth because I'm not going back to that kitchen and
Mhm.
cooking like you think the black folks are going to do during World War II. And so to have someone around who is a resource for you, and God bless him, at 98, he's just starting to get dementia, but it can be a resource and inspiration for you. Keeps the understanding of you just do it. Because if he hadn't, everybody else, and again, we don't just do things for ourselves, not just other brothers, because at that time it was only folks that had really been to elite military academies that got to be in that unit. And so he also opened the door for poor white guys who maybe went to public school or had a different background than the West Point and the Harvard and the Yale boys to get in there. And so keep going and understanding that eventually people are going to come on board and that you have a community to help you and to keep you motivated, even if it's not your uncle.
Mhm.
You got uncles by bond and cousins, play cousins, that will help you. And just know that and keep, like you said, just get it done.
Mhm. Mhm. And the stories are their own movement in a lot of ways. As you mentioned earlier in the conversation, these stories where some of these women didn't have the opportunity to get the reach, this becomes that ability for that story to move outside of that container and to go further. And again, it becomes possibility for so many others. Wait a minute, you're over there in that area and you still found the audacity to go up in that city hall and say what you need to say and demand what needs to be done. Again, the deliberateness of us staying quiet and believing that we can't when we can do anything and everything. And you know how I know? Because our ancestors and our elders that are still alive, because it's recent history. I have a 94-year-old grandmother. They did it with even more discrimination. I remember watching the Tulsa, Oklahoma documentary, and it was a elder on there, and he said, "I wonder sometimes what I could have done without the cloud of segregation and Jim Crow over my head constantly." And that's a call to action in a lot of ways. We're
Yeah,
dealing with our own mess, but then it was even more obvious and blatant and deliberate in the laws. So come on. And Jordan Hurston, I wonder what I could have done with resources. Like, y'all ain't even seen nothing. All the things I've done with resources, what I could have done.
exactly. I think about a young lady that works for me is going to Barnard College, Zora Neale Hurston's alma mater, in the fall. And I said, now, what if they had treated her in life with the same respect they gave her in death? She
Always.
would have been not just our Hemingway, she would have been Hemingway,
Hmm.
would have buried Hemingway with just sheer skill for narrative and character development, painting such vivid pictures. Um, yeah, but for
Yeah.
that, or even sometimes I joke with my partner and my little nieces. I say, all those people in the Bible that lived to 150, 200 years old and built all these things, I said, I think they were just talking about black people because somehow we managed to build this stuff and live to be 100 with all of these challenges. Imagine if they just left us alone.
Oh my gosh.
If they just left us alone.
Yeah.
That those were just not Africans they were interacting with. They were like, oh yeah, so and so was the king of this, and he was like 150 years old. I said, I think those were just black people who were not under the weight of constant oppression and attempts
Mhm.
to destroy their communities. That's a facetious way of saying, to your point, is if we had resources or if we simply didn't have the constant systemic challenges, God, how much richer of a state would Oklahoma have been if racism hadn't destroyed Black Wall Street?
Mhm. Absolutely. Unfortunately, we'll never know.
Well,
And therein lies the biggest issue. But all of that aside, because it happened, we know it happened, and it did stamp out a lot of talent and opportunity. But still, we have been doing it, like we said, and you're doing the work now. And each of us can make extraordinary changes. One person can do that. And so I so appreciate the work that you're doing. I have more questions. I just keep getting caught up in what you're saying, and sorry.
That's okay. These conversations are important, right? Step back and just be in awe of our people. And we're celebrating Black History Month, but also it's an opportunity to celebrate Blackness.
Oh, yeah. So, your episode featuring youth climate activists had a significant ripple effect, even leading to funding for a clean energy project. Can you tell us more about that experience and its impact?
Yeah, that was a great episode. And it is about having the temerity and the self confidence to go into the city hall and say something or just say something. Because on that episode, I literally said, all of you all who are listening, here she is, here's the work, here he is, here's the work, where's the money? So I said, some of my colleagues that I've worked in all three branches of government. So some of these
Mm,
people knew who I was talking to when I said some of my former colleagues. That didn't come out in the podcast, but I had done policy and legal and legislative work with some people that I knew were holders of resources. Like,
mhm.
here's a talent right here. Here's the proof of concept. Where's the money? And what happened from that episode was there was an introduction made. And as you said, they were ready. We stayed ready. The business plan was there. The engineering plan was there. The bias testing for the AI parts of the model were there. So while we're giving millions of dollars to people from other groups with janky PowerPoints and no plan to overcome algorithmic bias, these young people had it. And so the Department of Energy, as well as another large nonprofit, were like, thank you for bringing these people to our attention because this is obviously going to be a success. This isn't even a risky investment. This is a safe investment.
Yeah.
And I felt good for a moment, but also I had a little bit of side eye because I was like, look at what it took to get you to break through all of your built in either structural bias or personal bias to even see. Because what was your head full of that you couldn't see this project? Or what kind of criteria were you using that, and obviously, if you had no faces or names attached to it or no ages, this is a low risk, high return on investment project. All of their work is. Yeah. So I was elated in the moment, but then I sat back and I was, yeah, but.
Fighting for every opportunity, it shouldn't be so hard. But again, we know how to fight. And we know how to stand up and look people in their eyes and say, what you doing? And this isn't right. And what you're always going to need is us in some form or fashion.
Yeah.
Um, and so what you waiting on? Like, why does it take so long to get to us? When if you just used us from jump,
In the
you'd have been
beginning,
straight.
right? Like, why'd you walk all the way around the block to get across the street? Like, we have been here. You know
Yeah.
us. You know what we do
Every time
every
we show
single
up, we
time.
show out. Yeah, and so that's why I feel like it might be controversial, may not, but I feel like I can talk to you about this. I feel like DEI and affirmative action have been playing in our faces all the time. We don't get anywhere where we are in any type of position without the credential, the qualifications, the education. We wouldn't be there without it. Period. So a lot of times we're overqualified in a lot of ways, overeducated in a lot of ways compared to our counterparts. And so no, it's really just it's almost like to me telling girls and women you need to dress a certain way, you need to act a certain way so the boys and the men don't look and don't feel entitled. No, you need retraining and resocialization for the boys and the men because she gets to do whatever the hell she wants. And you need to focus on your implicit bias, your complicit
Yeah.
privilege, your your discrimination, your racism. That is the problem, not if we're qualified, not if we have merit.
Yeah, exactly. People were asking me why I wasn't more upset about the Supreme Court case when that happened or the rollback of DEI. And I said, the data bears out that it never benefited us to begin with. I know from lived experiences, being in those kinds of institutions of higher education and being on admissions committees, that what folks will do is they will pull an ambassador's kid from an African country so that they get the triple benefit of checking their DEI box, but also to the donors saying this is how many elite students we have and bump up their test scores. And please, to my African folks, I love all Black people. I'm not saying anything against you. I'm just telling you the system works. Rather than it being for the student who perhaps went to an underperforming public school but has the intellect to compete to be able to get that slot.
Hmm.
And I'm going to rip it off like it was an iron-on patch if it was part of what you were to do in the first place. A lot of that DEI stuff is tell me the
Performative.
least I can do to not feel bad about the way I treat you. That's what
Yeah.
DEI is. I'm going to give the Black people's support group in my company some extra money for pizza and report it on my corporate social responsibility and say I did DEI. And
Hmm.
so I was like, it did not help us in the first place. We have always either built our own spaces or been the most or overqualified person. I said, nobody's going to say that Melody Hobson is a DEI hire. All right. And she's probably one of the greatest financial minds of our time. And no one's
Hmm.
arguing about that, right? Like I would go on Joe Rogan and Joe Rogan would not argue with me about Melody Hobson's intellect. So I was like, if you want to get rid of it, fine, because you didn't do the work that was being required of you during DEI in the first place. Also, that's
Anyway.
not what we asked you for. We asked you to stop killing us and allowing the police to terrorize our neighborhood. We did not ask you
Hmm.
for DEI. So it's like, that was not what we requested.
Yeah. Respect.
And,
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of talk about Jasmine Crockett right now, and just seeing her brilliance and how qualified and educated she is. I'm like, yeah, we love our sister, but I'm worried about her stress levels and anxiety having to deal with these dunces every day that don't even deserve to be there and opening their mouth in her direction. But I digress.
threatening her.
Oh boy.
We're really going to pretend like that wasn't a workplace threat that we all just watched on television.
Only if she had did the threat. That's when
If
we
it was
would
the
have.
other way around, but that was a threat of physical violence.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It's good to know. It's good to be aware. It really is.
We see it.
Yeah.
And Congresswoman Crockett, you got people here in DC. Just never forget that you are at that level operating in that space, but there are also just people around. You need to walk away from that and go to the spa with some sisters while you're here in
Oh
DC. Like
yeah.
there are people who
Oh
will
yeah.
step up and help you take care of yourself so that you can go back into the fight refreshed.
There you go. Shout out to everyone doing the work, fighting the good fight, because it's not easy. It might look awesome, and it may look like you go get them, but why do I have to do this?
Why are we still doing this? And
2025.
I look at that cast of characters and I think about Malcolm X asking that question like, what other community, what other country are actors and comedians and the leaders? They're driving the public discourse. And there's so many people who are playing for extremist sections of social media platforms and are just not focused on the policy. And
Mm-mm.
then also feel at liberty to make threats against their coworkers and communities or want to take guns to work and all these absurd things. How did we get away from educated people running this country? Because complicated as they were, slaveholding as they were, our founding fathers were not dumb people. Like they were not people who lacked critical thinking or
Hmm.
literacy or the ability to communicate. And I think they would be ashamed of all of us if they came back
Yeah.
insane. And it's
One would
sad that
hope.
Black women are the ones that disproportionately have to put up with it. Because I see as Congresswoman Crockett and the squad,
Hmm.
whether he
Yeah.
sees it or not, Tim Scott with the missiles just somehow seem to fly in his direction.
Yeah, I just send positive thoughts and vibrations their way because it's not easy. She makes it
No.
look beautiful, intelligent, and all those things that she is, but it's not easy to have to deal with that. So yeah, our hearts go out to you, Congresswoman Crockett, and everybody else on the front lines. On the
On the
front
front
lines.
lines to you and your
Yeah.
team, because I was a staffer at one point in time and the whole team is working hard and putting up with a
Hmm.
lot.
For sure. So, your work often highlights the intersection of climate and digital equity. How do you approach connecting these complex topics in the podcast episodes?
And most of the time when we do it, it is either I explain it or I bring people on that explain it.
Mhm.
So at the beginning of this, I said the deepest point of inequity is around data and information. Good data about the extent of the disparity and the harm to people and the places around them can't be collected because of the lack of Wi Fi in these communities. And then information about the nature of the threat and the awareness, as well as resources to repair it, also can't get in
Mhm.
without this. And a lot of times, what people don't understand is where we put our fiber cable or our Wi Fi towers are places where public infrastructure was put during redlining and the intentional harm to Black communities. So it's on towers, it's on bridges, it's on rail places. And a lot of these places had already cut our communities in half or more pieces and overexpose us to the climate risk on top of it. And so the intersection is in the physical place, but it's also most greatly in the data and information. So I'll use the woman you're talking about from Mississippi. And she doesn't have Wi Fi. So she might not be able to do research about ag tech and climate tech that could do her work, and she couldn't deploy it. I would be curious about how the heat and drought cycles and derechos that Mississippi has been suffering are impacting her yields, but I can't measure it and talk to her about it because she doesn't have any Wi Fi.
Mhm.
So that's where the intersection happens. And we talk about anecdotes like that on the podcast to get people to understand.
Yeah, for sure. So, your books and podcasts both emphasize storytelling. How does
Mhm.
storytelling help advance this climate justice and digital equity in ways other forms of advocacy might not?
It is open. So a lot of research and science are behind paywalls. So you have to subscribe. You think trying to subscribe to different newspapers is a pain. Try getting a subscription to an academic journal or to a scientific magazine. And then when you can, it's communicated in a way that most people aren't
Mhm.
able to understand. We're communicating for people with PhDs and terminal degrees when the vast majority of the US population needs to be communicated to at an eighth or ninth grade level. Also, when we're talking about Black communities, storytelling is part of our culture.
Mhm.
Even as being a Southerner, William Faulkner said to be a Southerner is to always explain. I would see him and raise him and to say to be a Black person is to always explain, always have a story to tell, a joke to make. This is just how we communicate with each other.
Mhm.
So if I want the general population to understand in this world of podcasts and how we receive information, but particularly the folks that I'm mostly talking to are people in these Black communities that are suffering from things that they might not be aware that they're suffering from. I need to do it in a way that is natural and normal to them. And so, listening to a podcast that is centered in stories and anecdotes rather than me whipping out one of my academic papers or a law review article and reading it to you, which would be horrible.
For
Sit
sure.
down and tell a story. Tell the story about Baltimore or tell the story about how the Black Belt in Alabama is only 50 miles away from the Clotilde, the last slave ship on U.S. soil. And that slave ship and the way people live in that place are not disconnected from each other. That means something different than if I come to you and talk to you about particulate matter parts per million and
Yeah, my eyes start crossing
hmm
and I'm just shaking my head like I get it and I don't.
I just want this to stop.
So, I wanna understand, trust me, I do, but I don't. Please say something different quickly. So,
Real
yeah,
quick.
no, I respect that, and you're so right about our storytelling, and it's our way to convey the most complex idea and experiences to anyone in a lot of ways. So, yeah, and to know that is to be a true storyteller and a creative and doing the work because you have to connect with the people somehow.
Yeah. And we have the podcast, but also you have to go to where people are. I Did a story. I'm probably going to have some gamers on because some black gamers asked me to jump on their Among Us feed and talk to them about climate justice. I had no idea that this existed, or I understood how gamers communicated, and to be honest, wasn't too impressed from some of the shenanigans I've seen on Call of Duty. But then I
Mm,
realized like the community goes as the game goes, so I learned that from them. It's like, yeah, I'll talk to gamers. Here in DC, I was in a spades tournament, Anacostia. It was in the park, and I talked about why that park needed to be lit up with Wi-Fi while we were playing spades, and met some new fellow partners in making sure that we started to tell that story and to think more about making sure the neighborhood got the funding that it needed to get in order to not just do the park, but to do other public spaces in the neighborhood.
mhm, mhm,
Um, so wherever the chat needs to happen, sometimes we just have to go there and not get caught up in the way that it's going to happen.
mhm, mhm. And again, the awareness. Like Anacostia Park is one of my stomping grounds. Having lived in DC for many years, I'm sitting there. This is 20 years ago, but I don't realize what's missing, right? And that's what's happening. The neighborhoods don't realize what's missing. It's been missing so long. I don't even know what I get to have here. If only something changed or a public policy occurred or someone came and advocated for it, how much more my life would improve because it is now here. I don't even know that it's missing.
Yeah, because that's all that we've been given. We work with the geospatial imaging company, Esri. Much love to Koya and Clint Johnson, who do the social justice and the Black geo mapping work. Where I came on my side of the Potomac, because I live in Old Town Alexandria,
Okay.
and walked around. And sometimes I take Zoom calls from any of our public parks because not only do we have Wi Fi, but we have strong public Wi Fi that I could have done this podcast from out there and we would not have suffered in connectivity or quality.
Hmm. Hmm.
And there's bike paths and food trucks pull out by the park. And there's community gardens in many of the parks. And you can rent a plot, like a little plot of land to farm for yourself in any of our parks.
Mm.
And often the community has like community health events or vaccine drives that were run during COVID that were found to be highly effective or just now a feature of the parks. And then you
Hmm.
come over to Anacostia. We can look across the river at each other. And part of the skating rink is flooded. The bathrooms are not accessible, or not all of them are even functioning. There aren't water fountains all the way through the park. So we certainly aren't thinking about fun places to eat, connectivity. Can if I have a work from home day, maybe I want to be outside in the sunshine and not cooped up in my house. Like none of those things are possible. And so one of the things that we did, and it was painful to watch as people became too aware of, wait a minute, we don't have all of these amenities. And this is a national park. Like the National Park Service loves to come out here and point about how this is a Black national park, but we are not resourced like other national parks.
Hmm.
Um, so that is a part of the work and the storytelling that has to be done, but sometimes it's painful. And processing that pain as people become aware of. I knew I was getting the proverbial crumbs, but I did not know how small those crumbs were.
Mm. Absolutely. Thank you for doing the work. Anacostia is worthy of the work, and so is the community. I just have a couple of more questions for you. We have talked more than I've asked questions, and I've loved every minute of it. But I want to make sure that people understand who you are and what you're doing and why you're doing it. What do you hope listeners take away from your podcast, both on an emotional and actionable level?
I want people to believe in the power of being and doing because every single one of the guests has been undeterred from being who they are and contributing according to their talents.
Hmm.
And then the action that I want them to take from it is to pick a topic and say, you know what, maybe I can work on that.
Hmm.
Or maybe I want to look this person up and support them. Like many of the folks that are on my podcast and running nonprofits. So even if you just go on their donation page and give them $20 or $30, do that. But the call to action is to support and to use your talents to help move whatever the person is working on forward a little bit.
Okay. And what's next for the Undivide Project and your podcast? Are there any upcoming episodes, guests, or projects you're particularly excited about?
February 20th, we are collaborating with the Georgetown Earth Commons and the Hip Hop Caucus to show the Underwater Projects, which is a wonderful co-produced in part by Wanda Sykes that highlights the struggles of Black communities in Norfolk, Virginia, vis-a-vis climate change and divestment. So check that out, and also check out our and the other organizations' YouTube channels. I'm excited about that. We have managed on the Undivide Project side to use a mix of storytelling from people who talk to us and predictive analysis and AI to be able to get down to the county level and make the connection between health comorbidities and digital divestment and climate change. And so there's two counties, one in Texas and one in Georgia, where Black folks disproportionately have the big three: diabetes, high blood pressure, and heart disease, but they're also hyper exposed to climate risk and underexposed to digital information.
Mm.
So we're going to be releasing the results of that pretty soon. And then season 3 of the podcast, I'm going to have call outs on all of our social media and to our community network to say to me, who are these community folks that are doing the work, that don't have PR, that don't even know that they should be getting on podcasts and telling their story, and what can we do to lift them up? So that's what we're going to be doing in 2025, and you know, watching like everybody else what's going to happen and how we're going to respond to it.
Absolutely, because a response is in order, nothing less.
Nothing less. I
Nothing
know
less.
some people were like, oh, certain percentage is just going to rest. I'm like, no, I'm going to be more discerning about who I spend time with, but
Hmm.
we can't rest. If we rest, the
Yeah,
whole thing falls apart. So we're just going to have to work something
absolutely.
out.
Absolutely. You take your intentional rest and recharge, and then we get back to it.
Yeah. And then I'm guessing we're going to see you in Baltimore in the fall, right?
For sure. We'll be back October 17th through the 19th. Looking forward to it. So, yeah, I can't wait. And listen, the Georgetown, if it's open to the public, I'm going to be looking into getting tickets for that because that sounds very interesting.
Open to the public and free. It is actually going to be up on Eventbrite shortly. So I'll make sure you get the Eventbrite as soon as it's up. But yeah, the whole reason why that's called the Commons is that it's supposed to be an open space about bringing the resources and the brain power of the university to the community that it sits in. And so those events are open to the public. And also with the Undivide Project, and I think I can speak about the good people at the Hip Hop Caucus, like we wouldn't put on something and then cut off access to a story that's important. All the reasons we've been talking about this whole time we've had together.
Yeah. All right, listen, it has been such a pleasure getting to know you, learning about the Undivide Project, learning about all the work that you've done, all the initiatives. And I know that you are not done, which is just exciting because there's so much work ahead, necessary work, but the work that you're called to do that fuels you and feeds you to making sure that this world is a better place. And that's important. So I just want to say thank you for the work that you do, for the stories that you tell, and for the people that you provide a platform for, because it is important. And if not you, who? And it's important work, and I just appreciate it.
Thank you so much. And thank you for just holding space for me and for so many of us. I'm excited to watch the rest of the series, and just thank you for all that you do for our community and creators. And
Thank you.
all of that love and positivity right back at you.
I appreciate it. So tell folks where they can learn more about you, if you have a website, social media, and where they can listen to the Undivide Project.
This at Undivide Project, and the undivideproject.org is our website, which will bounce you to our YouTube channel and also to my other two websites just about me and research and other things that I'm doing besides this. And yeah, you can find our podcast on any of those links.
Okay. All right. And how can we support you besides subscribing to YouTube, listening, rating, and reviewing the podcast? How else can we rally around the work that you're doing?
When we tell these stories and release this information, pass it on, write letters. Particularly, I talked about, again, it's always Harris County, Texas, one of the most dumped on counties in the country. When we talk about Black people are being admitted for the big three, I'm going to have calls to action to say, like, forward this to other people, flip it to your local elected official if you live in Harris County. So just help us push the information out to people who need it. That is the support that we really need, because we're telling stories, but we're telling stories about people who need support.
Hmm. Hmm. Thank you so much. Again, Monica, this was a great conversation, and I'm ready to do the work right along with you. I appreciate your time.
Thank you so much. All right. Have a great one.